I was not a man who attended balls without a reason. In 3 seasons, I had declined 17 invitations to the Midsummer Assembly at Caldenmere Hall, and I had declined them without apology, without regret, and without the slightest curiosity about what I might be missing. The Midsummer Assembly was the crown jewel of the county's social calendar, or so I was told repeatedly by people who considered that fact more significant than I did. 500 candles in the great chandelier above the ballroom floor. 3 orchestras rotating through the night. The finest gowns from London and Edinburgh, the most eligible daughters, the most ambitious mothers, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the same conversation I had endured 1,000 times in London, in Bath, in every drawing room and dining hall in England. I had no use for it. But that summer, the summer of my 38th year, my steward had taken ill in June. My solicitor had written with a matter that required my presence at Caldenmere in July, and my closest friend, Lord Henshaw, had written a letter so characteristically theatrical in its pleading that I had read it twice before I admitted it had made me laugh. "Edmund," he had written, "if you do not come, I shall be forced to attend alone, which means I shall be at the mercy of Lady Croft's matchmaking, and I will hold you personally responsible for whatever disaster follows. Come, stand in a corner and look frightening. You are very good at that. No one will approach either of us. We will drink the claret and go home early. I promise you it will be the least tiresome ball you have ever attended." That was the argument that had moved me, not the 500 candles, not the 3 orchestras, not the matchmaking or the gowns or the county's great social calendar. The promise of claret and a corner and the company of a man I trusted completely. I arrived at Caldenmere Hall at 8:30. Henshaw found me in the entrance hall before I had given over my coat. "Edmund," he gripped my arm with the relief of a man rescued from drowning. "Thank God, Lady Croft has already spoken to me twice. Come into the ballroom before she attempts a third approach." I followed him into the light. The ballroom was everything it was reputed to be. The great chandelier burned above us with the warmth of 100 suns. The orchestra, the second of the 3, I learned later, was midway through a country dance, and the floor was crowded with the glittering, perfumed mass of the county's finest families, all moving and laughing and competing to be seen. The room smelled of beeswax and roses and the particular kind of powder that English ladies wore in the summer. It smelled like every ballroom I had ever stood in. I found my corner. Henshaw found the claret. For a quarter of an hour I was perfectly content. Then I heard the words. They came from the far side of the room, near the long windows that looked out on the terrace, and they came from a woman whose voice carried with the confidence of someone who has never in her life had any reason to lower it. I did not know her then. I would learn later that she was a Mrs. Aldgate, a widow twice married, the second time to a man of moderate property in the eastern county. She had 2 daughters of her own, both handsome, both well-dressed, both already on the dance floor. She had 1 stepdaughter, acquired by the second marriage, and by every evidence, tolerated as one tolerates a persistent draft from a poorly fitted door. "Nobody will want her," Mrs. Aldgate said to the woman beside her, with the pleasant, conversational ease of someone discussing the weather. "I have told people we have 3 daughters and the girl makes 4, and yet I do not bother including her in the count. Nobody will want a girl with no dowry, no beauty, and no conversation. She might as well be invisible. I'm only surprised she insisted on attending at all." There was a pause, and then the other woman murmured something sympathetic, and then they moved on to a discussion of the evening's music. I stood very still. I had, over the course of my life, heard a great many things I should not have heard. In my position, the Duke of Thornwall, as my father had been before me, and his father before him, people say things around you with the dual assumption that you are either not paying attention or do not care. I had learned early on that I heard more than anyone suspected. I heard the whispers behind fans, the murmurs across dining tables, the light, dismissive comments that people make when they have decided that a particular subject is not worth the full weight of their consideration. I had heard many such comments. I had rarely let them affect me. This one stopped something in my chest. Not because it was particularly cruel, though it was. I had heard crueler. It was the specific quality of it, the casual way it was delivered, the sense that Mrs. Aldgate was not even working at it, not even trying to be unkind, but had simply absorbed her stepdaughter into the category of irrelevant things and was reporting from there, the way one might mention that the roses in the East Garden were not doing well this year. A matter of fact. An inconvenience mildly noted. Nobody will want her. I turned without meaning to and found her. She was standing near the windows, just inside the curtains, in a gown of pale cream wool that was clean and well-made but not fashionable. Perhaps 2 seasons behind the cut, the sort of gown that announces, quietly, that the woman wearing it does not have the funds or the attention to match the room. She held a glass of lemonade that she was not drinking. She was not watching the dancers, though she stood where she could see them. She was watching the candles in the nearest candelabra, her gaze moving from flame to flame in a way that suggested she was somewhere else entirely, that she had built herself a small, private world inside the radius of that light, and had retreated into it. She was not the kind of woman who commanded a room. But she was not, I noticed at once, the kind of woman who was pretending she did not mind. There was a difference, and I had learned it young. Women who pretend they do not mind their situation have a particular quality to their stillness, a tension in the jaw, a slight overcorrection in the set of the shoulders, as if they are bracing against something. She had none of that. She stood as though she had decided at some earlier point in the evening what she was worth, and had found the answer satisfactory, and had arranged herself accordingly. She was tall, her hair was dark brown, put up in a simple style that the fashionable women around her would have called plain. Her features were not striking, in the conventional sense, but there was something about the expression on her face that I found I could not immediately look away from. A quality of watchfulness, of careful attention to the world that was not bitterness and not despair, but something more like scholarship, as though she were studying the room in the way one studies a text, looking for the thing that is actually being said beneath the words. She glanced up briefly, and our eyes met across the ballroom. She did not look away quickly, the way most women did when they found themselves under the gaze of the Duke of Thornwall. She held my eye for a moment, a calm, considering moment, the way one might look at an interesting passage in a book, and then she returned without ceremony to her candles. I found that I was walking toward her before I had made any decision to do so. "You are not dancing," I said, when I had crossed the room and arrived, which was not. I acknowledged, even as I said it, a particularly distinguished opening remark. She looked up from the candles. At close range, she was perhaps 25, perhaps a year or two younger, with gray eyes that were a shade darker than I expected, and a quality of composure that, in my experience, took most people 30 years and a great deal of loss to acquire. "No," she agreed, "I am not." "You prefer the candles." A small pause. "I prefer watching things that are honest," she said. "A candle does what it does not pretend to be more light than it is." I looked at her, a criticism of the room. "An observation," she said. "I leave criticism to those with the standing for it." I was at that moment the most powerful man in Caldenmere Hall, the Duke of Thornwall. 38 years, 200,000 acres in the north, a title that had been in my family for 4 generations, and a reputation for coldness that I had, I will admit, done very little to discourage. Criticism required standing, she had said, and she had not flinched. "I am Thornwall," I told her. "I know who you are," she said, without any change in her expression. "Your arrival caused the first genuine surprise of the evening. Lady Croft told Mrs. Hensworth, who told Mrs. Aldgate, who—" She paused, and something moved across her face so quickly I almost missed it. "Well, the news traveled." I heard in that pause what she had decided not to say. Mrs. Aldgate, her stepmother. She had heard the words or some version of them, or she had not needed to hear them because they were not new. "And you," I said, "you have not introduced yourself." "Eliza Vane," she said, "stepdaughter of Mrs. Aldgate, who will tell you I am a 4th daughter she does not count and who has no dowry, no beauty, and no conversation. I thought it more efficient to tell you myself." She said it with the perfect, unadorned plainness of someone stating a fact they have made their peace with, not with bitterness, not with the small, self-conscious laugh that usually accompanies such admissions. Simply with the matter-of-fact directness of a person who has decided that honesty, in a room full of performance, is the only position she can hold with dignity. I stared at her. "She is wrong," I said, "about 2 of the 3. A very brief silence, only 2. "The dowry remains to be seen," I said. Something shifted in her expression, something I could not yet read, a brief and complicated thing, and then she looked back at the candles. "You are unexpectedly forthright, Your Grace. You prefer honesty." I prefer it in candles, she said. I did not necessarily invite it in dukes. I laughed. It came out of me without warning, which was not something that happened often. Henshaw, across the room, looked up with an expression of such transparent astonishment that I nearly laughed again. "May I bring you something?" I asked. "You have not touched your lemonade." She looked down at her glass as though she had forgotten it was there. "It has gone warm," she said. "I have been standing here rather longer than I intended." "Then let me find you something less honest than a candle and more useful than warm lemonade," I said, "and you can tell me the rest of what you prefer not to say to dukes." She looked at me then, really looked at me, the way she had looked at the candles, with that quality of careful scholarly attention, and I had the sudden sensation of being examined by someone whose opinion mattered, though I could not have said in that moment why. "You are very strange," she said, not unkindly, "for a duke." "So I have been told," I agreed. She smiled. It was a small smile, careful and private, not the sort of smile women deployed in ballrooms to be seen. It was the sort of smile that happened when something was actually, genuinely, a little bit funny, and the person could not entirely prevent it. I fetched her a glass of cold punch, and I stood beside her by the window while the orchestra played and the great room glittered around us. And she talked to me in the same direct, unhurried way that she had established at the start, not performing, not angling, not wondering what I might think of her, but simply saying the things she was thinking, with a precision that I found more interesting than any conversation I had had in months. She told me she had been brought to Caldenmere 3 years ago, when her father married Mrs. Aldgate, and that she had found the county beautiful and the social life significantly noisier than she had been prepared for, having spent her childhood in a quiet house in Northamptonshire where her father kept a library, and considered a good book sufficient entertainment for most evenings. She told me she had read most of the library at Caldenmere Hall. It was open to the county's residents on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and that the collection was impressive but had a gap in natural philosophy that she found maddening. She told me that she had learned to embroider at the age of 7 under the instruction of an aunt who had very strong opinions about the correct tension for satin stitch, and that she still thought about it sometimes when she was anxious, which was useful. She did not tell me she was lonely. She did not tell me that her stepmother's words had landed in her like a stone in still water, sending rings of quiet hurt out to the edges. She did not tell me any of the things that were true and difficult, because she was not, I was coming to understand, the kind of woman who displayed her wounds to strangers. But I had heard the words, and I had watched her face when she mentioned Mrs. Aldgate's name. And I had stood beside her long enough to see the way she held herself with a composure that was real and hard-won, and also, just barely, a kind of armor. "You should go back," she said, after a while. "Your friend has been looking at you with an expression of profound confusion for the last quarter of an hour. It will do your reputation no good to be seen standing in a corner talking to a nobody." "My reputation," I said, "is already sufficiently established. It will survive." "Nobody will want her," she said quietly, echoing the words without emphasis, the way one quotes a thing not to give it power but to prove it cannot wound you in the open. She was looking at the candles again. "Mrs. Aldgate says it so easily. As though I am an inventory item that has failed to sell." A very small pause. "I do not say that for sympathy, Your Grace. I say it because I want you to understand that I am not, I have no expectations from this conversation. I am simply grateful for it. You are the first person to talk to me this evening who was not looking over my shoulder for someone more interesting." There was something in those words, in the quiet plainness of them, that reached in past the part of me that had spent 38 years building walls and caught. "Miss Vane," I said, and something in my own voice surprised me, some quality of steadiness that I had not intended to put there. "I am not looking over your shoulder." She glanced at me, the gray eyes careful and direct. "No," she said after a moment, "I can see that." The first orchestra ended. The second took up. Henshaw appeared at my elbow with a look of magnificent bafflement, was introduced, said something characteristically charming, and then watched in silence as Eliza Vane excused herself quietly and returned to the other side of the room where her stepmother was waiting. "Edmund," Henshaw said in a voice of complete wonder, "who on earth is that?" "A woman with no dowry, no beauty, and no conversation," I said, "according to her stepmother." Henshaw watched her cross the room. He was quiet for a moment, which was, for Henshaw, an unusual thing. Then, her stepmother, he said, is an absolute fool. I could not, with any honesty, disagree. I should have left it there. That is what I told myself in the days that followed, when I found myself returning to the memory of that conversation with a frequency that did not, I admitted to myself, reflect well on my powers of self-discipline. I was the Duke of Thornwall. I was 38 years old. I had an estate to manage, a solicitor waiting for answers, a steward recovering from illness, and 200,000 acres in the north that required my attention. I did not have time to stand at library windows and think about a pair of gray eyes and the particular quality of a woman who does not perform. But I did, as it happened, have a solicitor's matter in Caldenmere that required several weeks of attention. And Caldenmere Hall's library was open to the county's residents on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I am not, in general, a man who requires pretexts. I prefer to act on a reason or not act at all. But I will admit that I found the matter of the library considerably more convenient than it should have been. I found her there on the second Thursday, sitting in the window seat with a volume of natural philosophy that she had clearly found in some back corner of the stacks, because it was dusty in a way that suggested it had not been opened in a decade. She looked up when I came in, with that same calm, assessing quality she had had at the ball, as though she were confirming something she had already half suspected. "Your Grace," she said with the ghost of a smile, "you are not, I think, here for the natural philosophy." "I am not," I said. "I was told the collection had a gap." "It does," she said, "but you have not come to fill it." "No," I said. "I came to continue a conversation that was interrupted." She looked at me for a moment. Then she closed the book carefully and moved to make room on the window seat, which was, I was fairly sure, not what was done. Ladies in Caldenmere did not simply move over and make room for dukes in library window seats. But then, Eliza Vane did not appear to have arranged her behavior around what ladies in Caldenmere did. I sat. The window looked onto the library garden, which in July was a crowded, exuberant tangle of roses and lavender, and the ambitious climbing vine that had been allowed, over the course of several decades, to claim the entire east wall. A bee was doing important work somewhere in the lavender. A sparrow had established itself on the window ledge and was giving us a skeptical look. "What part of the conversation?" she asked. "The part where you were not saying things," I said. I found myself wondering what they were. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden. "My father died in March," she said at last. "He was the only person in the household who—" She stopped. "Then, he used to save things for me, books mostly. Letters he had received that he thought I would find interesting. Once a map of the northern coastline that he said he had bought because the cartographer's handwriting looked like mine. I have been thinking a great deal about that map." "Where is it now?" "I don't know," she said. "Things were rearranged after he died. I did not ask. It seemed a small thing to grieve." "It does not sound small." She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. "It isn't," she said after a moment. "But there are economies one makes in grief. I did not want to spend what I had on a map. I wanted to save it for the larger things." I thought about that. About the accounting of sorrow, the careful management of feeling in a house where she was not, by any accounting, first in anyone's priority. About what it cost, day by day, to be the kind of person she was in the kind of situation she was in. "The natural philosophy," I said. "What is the gap?" She blinked slightly. "I beg your pardon." "The gap in the collection. What is missing?" She looked at me with a cautious, considering expression, as though she were not entirely certain she had heard me correctly. "The work of several naturalists writing in the last 15 years, she said. "And there is a volume on the classification of coastal birds that I have wanted for some time, though I recognize that is a specific request and not a general gap." "I have the complete natural philosophy series at Thornwall," I said, "and I believe I have the birds." A pause. "Thornwall is in the north." "Yes, near the coast as it happens." She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, something careful and private and not quite what I could name. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you should know that the books exist," I said, "and because I intend to send for them." The pause that followed was longer. She was looking out at the garden again. The sparrow on the window ledge had formed an opinion about us and departed. "You are," she said slowly, "a very strange man, Your Grace." "So you have told me." I believe I said very strange for a duke, she said. I am prepared to upgrade it. I laughed again, I was beginning to understand, something that happened around her with a regularity I had not anticipated and did not particularly want to prevent. My father kept a library, she said after a moment more quietly. He would have liked you. He had very little patience for performance. I thought about her father, whom I had never met, the man who had saved books and letters and a map with familiar handwriting, the man who had died in March and left her in a house where she was the fourth daughter nobody counted. Tell me about the coastal birds, I said. She looked at me one more time with that particular quality of careful assessment that I was beginning to understand was not skepticism, but something closer to honesty. A refusal to take anything, including kindness, at less than its exact value. Then she opened her book again, found the page she wanted, and began to tell me. She talked for nearly an hour. About the birds, yes. About the taxonomy and the disagreements in the literature and the specific question of a type of gull that she had read two contradictory accounts of, but also in the way that conversations with her seemed to work, about the things that the birds led to. About the summer she had spent at the age of 12 in the field behind her father's house, recording the habits of a particular family of starlings in what she had called the starling papers, which had been, she said, the most scientifically rigorous undertaking of her childhood, and also, she admitted, the happiest. About how the field had smelled in summer and the specific quality of the afternoon light, and the way the starlings had organized themselves with a logic she had spent the whole summer trying to understand. I listened. I asked questions. The questions were genuine, which she could tell, because she answered them without the slight caution she deployed when she suspected a question of being decorative. When she left, the Tuesday library hours ended at noon, and she was punctual about respecting them, which I noted. She shook my hand with a formal, slightly grave courtesy that made me think of someone presenting credentials, and said that she had found the conversation useful, which was not a thing I had ever been told by a woman in a library before, and which I found, walking back to my rented house in the noon heat, I was thinking about considerably. The books arrived from Thornwall 12 days later. I had not told her they were coming. I had simply written to my housekeeper and asked that the Natural Philosophy series and the Coastal Birds volume be packed and sent south, care of Caldenmere Hall's library, with a brief note that I hoped would be legible. I was at my solicitor's office when she received them. I heard about it from Henshaw, who had been in the library that morning on entirely unrelated business and had, he claimed, merely happened to observe. She held the Birds volume as though it were made of something precious, Henshaw told me, with the expression of a man reporting a sighting of a rare phenomenon. Read the note 3 times, I counted. Then she sat very still for a moment, which I have decided to interpret as overwhelmed by generosity. Then she opened to the second chapter and began reading, and I believe she forgot I existed. You were watching quite closely, I observed. Edmund, Henshaw said, I have known you for 20 years. I have seen you send for books for 3 people in that time, and 2 of them were yourself. I said nothing. She is not who you expected, he said more quietly. No, I said, she is not. She is also not, he said with careful emphasis, in the kind of situation where she can, I mean only to say, Edmund, that she is entirely unprotected. If your interest is not, he stopped. Then, what is your interest? I looked at him. Henshaw, who had been my friend since we were 14, who knew me better than almost anyone, who had learned over 20 years when to press and when to wait. I am still determining that, I said. Determine it quickly, he said. She is the kind of woman who gets hurt by things she doesn't expect. I had been thinking the same thing for 12 days. I saw her at the Harveston dinner, which I attended on the grounds that my solicitor had matters there that required a social introduction, and at which she appeared in a gown of soft gray that was, as always, clean and well-made and not quite of the season, and sat at the far end of the table from her stepmother, speaking to the gentleman beside her with the characteristic quality of her attention, fully present, genuinely interested, not performing any interest she did not feel. The gentleman beside her was a vicar of about 50 with a kind face and an evident enthusiasm for the subject they were discussing, which I gathered, from the snatches that reached me across the table, was the classification of hedgerow plants. He looked, by the end of the first course, like a man who had been given an unexpected gift. I watched him sit up straighter, lean forward, answer her questions with an energy that had not been in his posture when the dinner began. This was, I was coming to understand, something she did, not deliberately, not as a strategy, but simply as the natural consequence of her attention. When she was interested in what someone was saying, they could feel it, and it changed the way they held themselves in the room. It was not flattery, and it was not charm in the conventional sense. It was simply genuine interest, offered without reservation, and it was rarer than I could have articulated and more powerful than I had expected. After dinner, in the drawing room, I found occasion to stand beside her while the other guests arranged themselves around the fire. "The vicar seems well satisfied," I said. She looked up. "Mr. Forsyth, he knows a great deal about hedgerow plants, more than anyone I have ever met. He spent 15 years as a curate in Sussex and kept meticulous records." A pause. Most people do not ask him about it. He looked almost surprised that I wanted to know. "People are often surprised when they are taken seriously," I said. She considered this. "Yes," she said after a moment, "they are." A small silence. Through the drawing-room windows, the evening was settling into its late summer blue, the kind of light that has all the warmth of the day still in it, but has turned the shadows long and quiet. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most important thing one could do for another person was to pay proper attention, not the performed kind, the actual kind." "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said simply, and then with the quality I had come to recognize as her particular form of trust, a quiet, careful extending of something she usually kept private. "I miss him every day, not loudly, but every day." I said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. I simply stayed where I was beside her, while the evening light changed in the windows and the conversation moved around the room, and she was quiet in the way she sometimes was, not withdrawn but present, in the full and unhurried sense of the word. At the Caldenmere garden party, the week after, I arrived in time to find her in conversation with two women from the village who were evidently discussing the question of a proposed school for the children of the estate workers, a project Mrs. Forsyth had mentioned at her last concert. Eliza was listening, again, with the weight of her full attention, and she asked questions that were so precise and well-considered that both women left the conversation looking as though they had thought further into the subject than they had expected to when they began. I did not interrupt. I waited until the conversation had ended and the two women had moved on, and then I came to stand beside her at the edge of the garden where the roses were doing what July roses do, which is everything at once. "You knew a great deal about the school," I said. "I have been thinking about it," she said, looking at the roses. "Mrs. Forsyth raised it a month ago and I could not quite put it down. The estate children have essentially no formal education. The nearest grammar school is 8 miles away. There is a very obvious thing that could be done if anyone wanted to do it." "You have a plan?" She looked at me. "I have an idea," she said with precision. "A plan requires resources and authority that are not mine to have." "What does the idea require?" A small pause. "A room," she said. 2 mornings a week, a teacher or someone willing to learn to teach, some books, some chalk." She paused again. "It is not complicated. Complicated things are sometimes easier to champion because they announce their own seriousness. Simple things require someone willing to be quiet about being right." I looked at her. "That," I said, "is one of the most accurate observations I have heard this year." She blinked slightly. "I said it very plainly." "Yes," I said, "that is what makes it accurate." The smallest of her smiles appeared at the corner of her mouth and vanished before it quite arrived. "You have a very particular way of paying compliments," she said. "I am precise," I said. "You have mentioned that. You appear to require reminders." This time the smile arrived properly, private and brief and entirely genuine, and I found that I wanted to say something else just to keep it there a moment longer. "The room," I said. "At Thornwall we have a schoolroom that has not been used in 15 years. I mention this in the spirit of information." She looked at me for a moment with that still assessing quality. "Thornwall," she said, "is in the north." "We have discussed this," I said. "You keep mentioning it," she said, "as though it is an argument for something." "It is," I said. "I have not yet been certain enough to say for what." A longer pause. She looked out at the roses, and I looked at her profile, the serious line of her jaw, the particular quality of her stillness, and thought, soon. Whatever I am going to do, it needs to be soon. Not because anything was urgent, not because the situation was precarious, but because I had, over the last month, arrived at a certainty I did not often arrive at, and there was a quality to it that was not comfortable. A quality of having understood something that required action. Eliza, I said, using her name for the first time without the title, without any of the small social distances. She looked at me slightly startled. Your Grace. Edmund, I said, if you are going to correct my form of address, you ought to use my own. A pause, then very quietly, Edmund. It was the first time. It sounded in her voice like something that belonged there. I am going to speak to you, I said. Not now, there is a better place and I want to do it properly, but I want you to know that I intend to. She looked at me for a moment that was several things at once, careful, wondering, and underneath both of those, something that was very carefully not letting itself be named yet. All right, she said at last, quietly. I will know that. At Mrs. Forsyth's evening concert, which I attended on the grounds that Henshaw needed a companion, and I happened to be available, which was not the most dignified pretext I had ever employed, but was sufficient. Eliza sat 3 rows in front of me and to the left, and the musician who played that evening was a young man from the village who performed with a technical competence that was not quite equal to his evident passion, and I watched her listen. She listened to music the way she listened to everything, with the full weight of her attention, leaning slightly forward, her head tilted in the precise attitude of someone who is not simply receiving sound, but actively working out what it means. When the young man played something that surprised her, there was a passage in the third piece that was genuinely lovely, better than anything that had preceded it. Her face changed in the way it changed only when something was actually affecting her, which was different from the polite appreciation of the rest of the room. Afterward, in the brief standing interval before people collected their wraps, I watched her cross to the young man at the piano. I could not hear what she said, but I watched the young man's face change, watched the anxious post-performance tightness go out of his shoulders, watched him nod and look at the piano keys, and then up at her with the expression of someone who has been told something true that they did not expect to hear. I did not hear the words, but I had been watching her long enough to know what she was doing. She was paying proper attention, the actual kind. She found me afterward near the door. He is very good, she said, better than he thinks he is. You told him so. I told him what I actually heard, she said. The third movement was genuinely skilled. He was playing from something real in the third movement. The rest was competent, but the third movement was different. She paused. He looked as though no one had said so. Because no one had, I said, not in the way you said it. She considered this. The difference between performed praise and actual notice, she said. Yes, I said. You are rather remarkable at the second. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the space where the young pianist had been, who had now been absorbed back into the general crowd. My father used to say that most kindness goes wrong not because people are unkind, but because they do not pay enough attention to know what the actual kind thing is, she said. I have always thought he was right. I thought, not for the first time that summer, about what it would be to have her at Thornwall. Not the practical questions, though those were settled in my mind, and had been for some time, but the larger, simpler question of what the place would be with her in it. The library windows, the north coast in the morning. The particular quality of her attention turned on a world large enough to deserve it. I have been meaning to ask you something, she said. Ask. The books from Thornwall, the note. A pause. You said in the note that you hoped the coastal birds would be useful. It was a very short note, very correct. She looked at me. Did you mean anything more than that? I looked at her steadily. Yes, I said, I meant a great deal more than that. She held my gaze for a moment. Then, I thought so, she said. I was not entirely certain I had read it correctly. You read it correctly, I said. Another pause. Around us the room was gathering itself to leave, the comfortable noise of coats and carriages and good nights. We stood in it, slightly apart, and I was very aware of the distance between us and very aware of the fact that it was, in most of the ways that mattered, no longer as large as it had been. All right, she said simply, and then looking up at me with the gray eyes clear and direct and entirely honest. Edmund. Eliza, I said. and we went out into the evening. There was one more afternoon before the harvest ball that I want to tell you about. Not because it was dramatic, it was the opposite of dramatic, which is perhaps why it matters. It was a Wednesday, which was neither a library day nor a social occasion, and I had ridden out to the eastern edge of the county to look at a property matter that my solicitor had flagged. And on the way back I had taken a longer route than was necessary because the afternoon was fine and I was in no particular hurry. And I had come, by a road I had not intended to take, past the edge of Mrs. Aldgate's land. She was in the lane, not walking in any purposeful direction. She had a basket over her arm with what appeared to be a collection of small plants wrapped in newspaper, and she was moving slowly along the hedgerow with the attention she gave things when she was actually looking at something, which was different from the attention she gave things in rooms. She had not seen me. I stopped my horse. She was looking at the hedgerow with the same quality she had brought to the vicar at the harvest and dinner, the same full-weight attention, and after a moment she reached out and touched a branch. A very small, careful touch, the way you touch something you want to understand without disturbing. And then she wrote something in a small book she had produced from somewhere in the basket. I watched her for a moment. She was, I want to say, happy because the word comes close, but it is not quite precise. She was in full possession of herself. That is the better phrase. There was no pulling back, no slight reorganization of her posture in anticipation of a judgment. She was simply a woman in a lane on a fine afternoon in August, looking at a hedgerow, writing something down, with her basket over her arm and her hair coming loose from its pins on one side. She looked up when she heard the horse. For a moment she was startled, genuinely, briefly startled, the way one is caught in a moment of unguarded selfhood. Then she saw who it was, and the expression changed to something I had not quite seen before. Not the composure and not the private smile. Something that was quieter than both of those and more unguarded than either. "Edmund," she said, just that, with the ease of someone who has used a name long enough that it fits. "Eliza," I said, dismounting. "What are you planting?" She looked down at the basket with what I could only describe as a modest, guilty expression, which on her was a thing of considerable charm. "Foxgloves," she said, "and a kind of wild garlic that Mr. Forsyth told me has been disappearing from this particular stretch of hedgerow for 30 years. He said it used to grow here when he was young." A pause. I asked the groundskeeper if I might. He seemed surprised that I asked. "Did he object?" "He said the hedgerow was nothing to do with him, and I might do as I liked," she said, "which I have chosen to interpret as permission." "A reasonable interpretation," I said. She looked up at me, slightly amused. "You should not encourage my liberties." "I should and will," I said. "What is in the notebook?" She looked down at it with the same slight guilty expression. "Observations," she said, "about what is here, what used to be here, what Mr. Forsyth said was here when he was young." She paused. "I have been doing it for the whole summer somewhat. This particular lane and the one to the north, I thought I did not have a specific plan. I simply thought it was worth knowing." I looked at her in the late afternoon light in the lane with her basket and her guilty notebook and her loosened hair and her foxgloves wrapped in newspaper. I thought about the starlings, the starling papers, the 12-year-old in the field behind her father's house, recording with complete scientific seriousness the habits of a family of birds. "It is worth knowing," I said. She looked at me. "Most people would find it rather," she stopped. "Rather what?" "Odd," she said. "Unnecessary, the kind of thing one does when one has not enough to occupy one." "Most people," I said, "do not know what they are missing." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the hedgerow. A bee went past with great urgency on its way to somewhere important. The afternoon light was the particular gold of August at 4 o'clock, the kind that makes everything it touches look like it has been made out of something worth keeping. "I have been thinking," she said at last, still looking at the hedgerow, "about the north. About what you said about the coast. About," she paused, choosing the words with care, "about what it would be to be in a place large enough." I said nothing because the thing she was saying did not require a response. It required listening. "I have spent 3 years," she said, "making myself smaller, not dramatically, not in any single large act, but a degree at a time, not saying the thing I was thinking, not going to the place I wanted to go, not writing down the thing I wanted to write down in case someone came past and found it odd." A pause. "I am rather tired of it." "Good," I said. She looked at me, startled slightly by the simplicity of it. You should be tired of it, I said. You should have been tired of it 3 years ago. A silence. The bee had accomplished its errand and returned. The hedgerow, she said, will be here next year. And the year after. I thought, if I recorded what is here now and what is missing, there would be a record of it, even if nothing comes of the knowing. Something may come of the knowing, I said. Perhaps, she looked at the notebook, then at me. Or perhaps it will simply be a record. My father always said that was enough, to know a thing precisely, even if only you know it. That precision has its own value. I thought about that for a moment, about precision and its value, about a woman who understood that the act of careful attention was worth something whether or not anyone else received it. I thought about the summer, which was ending, and about the question I had been working toward, which was no longer a question but a fact waiting for the right moment to be stated. Walk with me a while, I said, if you are not in a hurry. She considered this with the gravity she brought to everything, which I had come to understand was not solemnity but simply respect. For the question, for the asker, for the possibility of a genuine answer. I am not in a hurry, she said. We walked the lane for half an hour, with my horse ambling behind us and her basket on her arm, and she showed me 3 plants she had identified and written about, and one that she had been trying to identify for 6 weeks without success. I told her about the cliff walk at Thornwall, about the particular species of stonecrop that grew on the rocks above the sea that I had never seen anywhere else, and had always meant to ask someone about and never had. She looked at me with the full starling attention. Could I see it? She asked. Yes, I said, you could see all of it. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the hedgerow and wrote something in the notebook, and I did not ask what. Lady Pembroke's Harvest Ball was the last great event of the Caldenmere social season. It was given every year on the 15th of August, in the long gallery of Pembroke House, which had been cleared of its furniture and laid with boards for dancing, and was considered, by the people who considered such things, to be the social peak toward which the entire summer had been building. I had been invited. I had, until recently, had no intention of attending. I sent my acceptance the same day I confirmed, through Henshaw, that Miss Vane would be there. I arrived at 8:30, which was later than was usual for me and earlier than was fashionable, and I stood in the entrance hall for a moment and let the sounds of the ball come to me. The orchestra, the voices, the movement of 200 people under the light of another great chandelier. I thought briefly about the first ball. About the far side of the room, the long windows, a woman in pale cream wool with a glass of warm lemonade she was not drinking. I went in. She was near the windows again. Of course she was. The same composure, the same quality of existing slightly apart from the room without being diminished by it. She wore a gown of deep blue this time, not fashionable still, but the color was extraordinary, the precise shade of the northern sea in October, and it made the gray of her eyes red as something entirely new. She was watching the dancers with the careful scholarly attention I had come to recognize as her default state, and she did not see me come in. I did not go to her immediately. I wanted to see the room first. I wanted, if I am being honest, to give myself a moment with the thing I was about to do. Not because I was uncertain of it. I had not been uncertain of it, I realized, since the library window seat, but because I had a natural disinclination to act before I had seen the whole field. I found Henshaw by the far wall, where he had established himself with a glass of wine and an expression of a man keeping a very interesting secret. "She's here," he said. "I can see that. She's been here for an hour. She arrived with Mrs. Aldgate and the 2 proper daughters, and then the proper daughters were immediately danced away, and Mrs. Aldgate began to do what Mrs. Aldgate does, which is to tell everyone within range approximately how much she does not value her own stepdaughter." He paused. "I have heard the words, 'Nobody will want her,' 4 times in an hour, Edmund, each time like she's talking about the weather." I said nothing. "Are you going to do something?" Henshaw asked. "Yes," I said. "Soon?" "Presently," I said. "Edmund," his voice was very quiet now, with a warmth underneath the lightness that was genuine and old in 20 years of friendship. "She has been standing by those windows for an hour, and she has not moved, and she has been watching those dancers with the face she wears when she is making the best of something. I know you are precise. I know you like to see the whole field, but the field is quite clearly visible, and she has been standing there for an hour." I looked at him. "I know," I said. And then, at the far end of the room, I saw Mrs. Aldgate appear at her stepdaughter's side. She arrived with the smooth, practiced movement of a woman who has long ago ceased to worry about whether her approach is welcome. She said something to Eliza. I was too far to hear it, and I watched Eliza's posture shift, that minimal, involuntary pulling back, the slight reorganization of her stance that happened whenever her stepmother came near. Then Mrs. Aldgate turned to the woman beside her, a friend, a neighbor, someone she was comfortable with, and I heard her voice carry across the gathered noise of the room the way it had on the first night, with the same pleasant conversational confidence, the same ease of delivery. "You see, this is the difficulty," Mrs. Aldgate was saying. "She will insist on coming, and then she stands about and speaks to no one of consequence, and one is forced to invent reasons for her being here when people inquire. I have done my best. But there is only so much one can do with a girl who has nothing to recommend her. Nobody will want her. I said so at the start of the season, and I say so now. Nobody will want her, and the sooner she accepts it, the better for everyone." Eliza did not move. She was looking at the dancers, her profile composed, her hands still at her sides. "Nobody will want her." I was already walking. I had not planned the exact shape of it. I had planned to speak to her, to be clear, to make my position known. I had not planned what it would look like to the room. But I had been, since the first night, a man who heard things he could not unhear. And I had been, since the library window seat, a man who was increasingly and irrevocably certain of something. And I had spent enough years in drawing rooms and dining halls to understand that what I did in the next 60 seconds would be read and interpreted, and remembered by every person in this room for years to come. I had no difficulty with that. I crossed the ballroom floor. The room was crowded, and I did not stop for anyone. I was the Duke of Thornwall. People moved. Later, Henshaw told me that the parting of the crowd around me had been, in his estimation, one of the most imposing things he had ever seen in 20 years of watching me move through rooms. I was not thinking about what it looked like. I was thinking about gray eyes and a dusty volume of natural philosophy, and a map with familiar handwriting and the specific vocabulary of a woman who had decided what she was worth and was not, under any circumstances, going to negotiate. I reached her. She had heard the footsteps, or felt the shift in the room around her because she had turned, and her gray eyes were on my face when I arrived, with an expression I had not seen on her before, not the composure, not the careful assessment, but something more immediate, something that was almost not fear exactly, but the particular quality of a person in the middle of an unexpected moment who is not yet certain what it means. Mrs. Aldgate had also turned, and Mrs. Aldgate's companion. And in the spreading ripple of awareness that moved through the room when the Duke of Thornwall crossed a ballroom floor with a purpose, no one could mistake, approximately half of the assembled guests at Lady Pembroke's harvest ball. I did not look at Mrs. Aldgate. I looked at Eliza. "Miss Vane," I said. My voice was steady. I had not been entirely certain it would be, but it was. "I have been intending to speak to you for some time on a matter of some importance, and I have put it off longer than I should have, and I find that I am not willing to put it off any longer." She was very still. "Your Grace," she said, in a voice that had the quality of something carefully held. "I have spent this summer in your company," I said, "in the library and at the Harveston dinner and at Mrs. Forsyth's concert, and in 4 or 5 other places that I attended with considerably more deliberate purpose than I generally admit to attending anything. I have found your company to be—" I stopped, chose the word that was accurate. "Irreplaceable. I have found you to be the most genuinely, completely interesting person I have met in longer than I can measure. I have found that the question of what you are thinking is the question I most want answered in any given room. I have found that the conversations we have had are the conversations I return to, and that I have no interest in the approach of autumn, which would end this season and return me to Thornwall without having said so." The room was very quiet. The orchestra had not stopped. The music continued behind us, a waltz, slightly ironic in the circumstances. But the voices around us had stilled in the particular way they still when everyone present has understood that something is happening that will be discussed for a long time afterward. Mrs. Aldgate made a small sound. I still did not look at her. "What I am saying," I continued to Eliza, who had not moved, whose gray eyes had not left my face, "is that I would like to ask your permission to call on you. Formally, to make my intentions known to whoever ought to be told. And I am saying it here in this room, in front of everyone, because I believe in precision, and I have always found public precision preferable to private ambiguity. A pause. Around us, the room held its breath. "You are a duke," she said quietly. "I am," I agreed. "You could have anyone." "I could have a great many people," I said. "I want you. Those are not the same category." Something moved across her face, that private, complicated thing I had seen flicker across it once before in the library when I had told her about the books. But this time it did not retreat. This time it stayed, and I could see, clearly and unmistakably, what it was. It was the precise expression of a person who has spent a very long time being told what they are worth and has just been offered, by someone they have reason to believe, a different accounting. "Nobody will want her," Mrs. Aldgate said. Not loudly, but in the silence of the room quite audibly. I believe she said it out of habit or reflex or the sheer bewilderment of the moment. She would tell herself later that she had meant it as a caution, as a practical observation for the benefit of a duke who clearly needed one. What it sounded like in the silence of that ballroom was precisely what it was. I turned then and looked at her. For the first time all evening, I looked at Mrs. Aldgate directly. I did not raise my voice. I had, in my 38 years, never needed to raise my voice. The Duke of Thornwall did not shout. He did not need to. "Nobody," I said, "has been paying attention." The silence that followed was of the particular ringing quality that comes when a thing has been said that a great many people in the room were, it turned out, waiting to hear. Then very quietly I heard Henshaw begin to laugh. He managed to convert it to a cough, but I knew what it was, and I suspected everyone near him did as well. Across the room, Lady Pembroke's expression was one of a woman who has just witnessed something that will enter the social history of the county and does not know whether to be alarmed or delighted. The woman beside Mrs. Aldgate was looking, with evident difficulty, at a point slightly above Mrs. Aldgate's head. Mrs. Aldgate herself had gone a shade of color that was entirely new to me. I turned back to Eliza. She was, and I will carry this image with me for the rest of my life. She was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and something else. Something I could not yet name, but that settled into me like warmth after a long time in the cold. Her hands, at her sides, had uncurled from their careful neutrality. Her chin was up slightly, not with defiance, but with something I recognized after a moment as the particular quality of a person who has carried a weight for a very long time and has just felt someone else put their hands beneath it. "You are," she said softly, "still a very strange man." "I know," I said. "Do you mind?" She looked at me for a moment that felt longer than the rest of the evening combined. Then, in a voice that was very quiet and absolutely steady, she said, "No, I find I do not mind at all. I will tell you what followed, because the rest is as true as the beginning." I called on her the next morning. Not at Mrs. Aldgate's house. I was not, I will admit, in any mood to navigate Mrs. Aldgate's drawing room at 8 in the morning, but at the library, where I arrived early enough that I was able to unlock the reading room and have the window open before she arrived. She came at 10 o'clock, in a walking dress of practical brown that was the most informal thing I had yet seen her in, and she carried the Coastal Birds volume under her arm as though she had not put it down since the last Tuesday session. She found me in the window seat. She looked at me for a moment with the startling quality, that complete, assessing attentiveness. And then she sat down, and the morning light came in through the window and lay across the table and the books and the two of us in the easy, unhurried way that morning light in July does, as though it has all the time in the world. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said last night." "Which part?" "Most of it," she said, "but particularly the pause. You said I was the most genuinely interesting person you had met in longer than you could measure. You said it in front of 200 people. She was looking at the table, at the spine of the Bird's volume. "I have been turning it over, trying to determine whether you said it in part because the room needed to hear it, because Mrs. Aldgate needed to hear it, whether any portion of it was not for me exactly. I considered this. I could have answered it quickly. But she deserved the full consideration, so I gave it the full consideration, and when I had the answer, I gave her that. "No," I said, "every part of it was for you. The fact that Mrs. Aldgate heard it was, I will not say it was incidental because it was not. I wanted her to hear it. But what I said was true regardless of who was present, and I would have said it to you in an empty room." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the birds. "My father told me," she said, "that the difficulty with being overlooked is not the first time. The first time is surprising. It is the accumulation. The 23rd time and the 57th time and the 100th time, when the weight of it has become so familiar that you cannot quite remember what it was like to carry nothing." She looked up. "I had forgotten what it felt like when someone," she stopped. Then, with precision, "when the accounting was different." I thought about the words I had not been able to unhear. "Nobody will want her." Said the way you say the weather won't hold. Said the way you say a thing that has never required revision. "The accounting," I said, "has always been different." Mrs. Aldgate was working from the wrong numbers. Something shifted in her face, a kind of light, brief and startling, like sun through cloud. "You are," she said, "remarkably good at being precise when precision is exactly what is needed." "I have had to explain this to you twice," I said, "3 times counting the note." "4," she said, "if you count the window seat. You were precise about the birds." "I stand corrected," I said. She smiled, not the small, contained version. The proper one, warm and unself-conscious and entirely present in the room, taking up exactly as much space as it deserved. We talked for 3 hours. About Thornwall and the north, and what the coast looks like in October. About the schoolroom question and whether 2 mornings a week was sufficient and who might be persuaded to teach and what the books would need to include. About her father and the library he had kept and the way he had talked about ideas, as though they were living things worth taking care of. About my own father, who had been a man of few words and great precision, and my mother, who had been exactly the opposite, and the particular sort of life one builds in the space between those 2 temperaments. I told her about the walls I had built over 38 years, which had been excellent walls, well constructed and largely weatherproof, and which had started in July to develop structural problems I had not anticipated and could not, in honesty, bring myself to repair. She listened the way she always listened, and then she said, "I think the walls were necessary. I think they kept you upright when you needed to be upright. I don't think they kept the wrong things out." I looked at her. What did they keep out? She held my gaze. "The right things," she said, "until now." I spoke to her formally, 2 days later, in the manner that the situation required. I spoke also to my solicitor, and to the question of a settlement that would make her permanently free of whatever the situation with Mrs. Aldgate had been and still was. I will not detail those conversations, except to say that I was, in them, precise and thorough, and sufficiently firm that nothing needed to be said twice. Eliza's response, when I told her the settlement was arranged, was to look at me with the full weight of her attention and say, "You have been remarkably efficient." "I told you I prefer precision," I said. "You have also," she said carefully, "been remarkably generous. The settlement is appropriate," I said. "It is more than appropriate," she said. "You did not need to be so thorough." "I needed," I said, "for your position to be exactly what it should be. That is not generosity, that is accuracy." She looked at me, the gray eyes steady and clear, and I noticed no longer carrying the particular quality of care that had been in them for the first weeks, the careful measuring, the not quite trusting. They were simply present now, fully, unreservedly present. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "Accuracy." "It is what the settlement is," I said. "What this is," I paused, because I was a man who did not use words he did not mean, and I wanted to be precise. "What this is," I said, "is the thing I was least prepared for and most certain of in whatever measure of my life I have remaining. I find that I cannot improve on that description." She was quiet for a long moment. "It is accurate," she said at last. "Yes, it is." We were married in October, at the small church in the village nearest Thornwall, which was not the kind of wedding that required 3 orchestras or 500 candles or the full attention of a county's social calendar. It required the vicar, who was kind and efficient. It required Henshaw, who wept and will deny it to his grave, which I intend to dispute at every opportunity for the rest of our natural lives. It required my housekeeper, who had been at Thornwall for 30 years, and who had, when I wrote to tell her we were coming north, prepared the east wing with the specific warmth of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a house to become what it was always supposed to be. And it required Eliza, in a gown the color of the northern sea, standing beside me in the morning light, making the short and serious promises that she made in the precise, unhurried way she did everything. On the first evening at Thornwall, I showed her the library. It was the largest room in the house, the one my father had cared about most, and in the 40 years since he had begun the collection it had grown into something formidable, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, ladders on rails, a great central desk that was currently obscured by 6 months of correspondence I had been intending to sort. The 4th wall was windows. On a clear night in October, which this one was, you could see the coast from those windows, the cliff edge, the dark sea, the lights of the village to the south, and above all of it the extraordinary, unreasonable darkness of a northern sky with no city for 50 miles to dim it. She went to the windows first. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the cliff and the sea and the sky, and she did not say anything. "The natural philosophy is on the 3rd wall," I said after a moment. "Complete, including the 15-year gap. The coastal birds are on the 2nd shelf, left section." She turned from the window and looked at me. In the firelight of the library, her face had a quality I had not seen before, open, in a way that was different from the careful openness she allowed herself in other places, as though she had set down something she had been carrying for a very long time and was still adjusting to the new lightness of her own hands. "Edmund," she said, "just the name. No title, no social distance, no qualification. Thank you." I had not in 38 years been thanked in precisely that way, for precisely the thing the word was being used for, not the house or the settlement or the title or any of the practical things. For I could feel in the word the whole weight of the summer, the library window seat, the coastal birds, the conversation that was only itself. I crossed to where she was standing and offered her my hand. She looked at it for a moment, that brief, assessing quality, and then she took it. "The books will still be there in the morning," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "they will." She looked up at me, and the gray eyes in the firelight were the color of the sea and the color of October, and the color of something I could not name except that it was warm. "As will the coast," I said, "if you want to walk it." "I do want to walk it," she said. "Then we will walk it," I said, "in the morning and every morning after for as long as you like." She was quiet for a moment in the good way, the way she was quiet when she was not performing neutrality, but was simply entirely present and still. "Nobody will want her," she said softly, the way she had said it twice before, not to wound herself with it, but to hold it up to the light and see it for what it was. A thing someone had said that had been believed for long enough to feel like a fact, and had turned out to be simply, plainly wrong. "Mrs. Aldgate," I said, "was working from insufficient information." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was closely related to one. "And you, did you have sufficient information?" "By the end of the first conversation," I said, "I had everything I needed." She considered this. "I needed rather longer." "I know," I said. "You were careful, you were right to be." "Was I?" A small pause. I think I was afraid, not of you particularly." "Of what it would mean to," she looked for the right word, "to revise the accounting. I had carried it so long, I knew the numbers were wrong, but knowing a thing is wrong and releasing it are not always the same step." "No," I said, "they are not." "What changed it," she said quietly, "was not the ball, not you crossing the room. That was extraordinary, and I will not pretend it wasn't. But what changed it was before that. It was the library, the window seat, the books from Thornwall, the way you sat and listened and asked the questions you actually wanted the answers to. The conversations that were," she looked at me. "The conversations that were only themselves, not about what I was or wasn't, what we were thinking." "Yes," I said. "That was what I needed," she said. "To be thought with, not thought about, thought with." A pause. "You thought with me." I had spent 38 years being the Duke of Thornwall. I had been feared and respected and managed and occasionally, very carefully, trusted. I had not in 38 years been thought with, particularly, not in the way she meant, the equal, fully weighted, genuinely mutual thing. "You started it," I said. "In the first conversation, the candles." She smiled, the real one, the one she had not been giving ballrooms for 3 years. "I thought you were interesting," she said. "Very strange, but interesting." "And now?" "Still both," she said. "In the best possible configuration." I looked at her in the firelight in the library at Thornwall, with the sea outside and the dark northern sky above it, and the books on 3 walls and the whole house changed, finally and entirely, into what it had always been missing. "Eliza," I said. She looked up at me. "I am going to tell you something," I said. "Precisely." You are always precise, she said. I have come to rely on it. Good, I said. Then I will say precisely this. I am not accustomed to gratitude in the specific form of this. For you. For the fact that you were standing in that ballroom in July watching candles, and that I was in the corner with Henshaw, which remains the most useful thing Henshaw has done for me in 20 years. I am not accustomed to it, and I find that I have no desire to become accustomed to it. I would rather spend the rest of my life in a state of mild and ongoing astonishment, because that appears to be the honest description of what this is. She looked at me with the full starling attention, the complete, unhurried weight of her presence. Edmund, she said very quietly. Yes. Nobody will want her. The words, one final time, now so light they were almost nothing, a thing that had been heavy and was no longer. No, I said, as it turned out. As it turned out, she agreed. And then she laughed, not the small, careful laugh she had given in borrowed rooms for 3 years, not the contained, private version she deployed when she could not quite prevent it, but a proper laugh, a generous one, the kind that requires enough room and simply takes it. It filled the Thornwall library. It went out the windows toward the northern sea. I stood in the firelight and thought, there it is. That is what she sounds like when there is room enough to be. I kept that sound in me like a held flame for the rest of my life. She gave me a great many things. The books she pressed on me, the observations she made in the morning about the light over the cliff, the questions she asked about things I had stopped noticing, the particular quality of her attention on a problem we were working through together, the way she laughed at things I said that I had not known were funny until she found them so. The school she built in the village, which in the end required not just 2 mornings a week but 5, and a second teacher, and 3 years of her persistent, precise attention. The children who came in the first winter and sat in the old schoolroom with its unwashed windows and its dusty slates, and learned, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to read, while she sat in the back and watched with the same expression she had worn watching the starlings. The way she walked the coast every morning without exception, even in weather that would have kept me inside, and came back with her hair unpinned by the wind and her cheeks red, and her boots muddy and her eyes full of whatever the sea had told her. I kept that sound first, though, because it was the sound of the room being large enough. Because I had promised her enough room. And because, as I told her more than once in the years that followed, on the cliff and in the library and in the particular quiet of early morning with the sea outside, and the fire lit, and the books on 3 walls and Henshaw's last letter somewhere on the desk needing an answer, nobody, in the end, had simply been failing to pay attention. I had paid attention. From the first moment, in the ballroom with the candles. And everything that followed for all the rest of our lives was precisely what that was worth.